Hello and welcome to the Scanlon Leadership Interview Series, sponsored by the Scanlon Leadership Network and Foundation. I'm your host, Ron Duffy. In these interviews, you'll meet successful business leaders and entrepreneurs who talk about what it takes to become a great leader and share their experiences building effective organizations with a Scanlon plan. A Scanlon plan is an innovative leadership process for total organization development. It consists of a set of assumptions about human motivation and behavior, general principles for management based on these assumptions, and specific procedures for implementing these principles. The Scanlon Leadership Network is a nonprofit association of high-performance, values-led organizations founded by Joe Scanlon and Dr. Carl Frost. Joe Scanlon was a steelworker and MIT lecturer who in the 1950s pioneered some of the first high-performance work systems based on the revolutionary idea that the average employee wants to work and has great creativity if given the opportunity. Dr. Frost carried on Scanlon's work at Michigan State University, conducting research and installing Scanlon plans. Member organizations have won the Baldrige Award, the Shingo Prize, hundreds of supplier awards, and 5 have been ranked in the top 50 best places to work in North America. The Scanlon Leadership Network is considered one of the best-kept secrets in American business. The Scanlon Leadership Network and Foundation brings this series of interviews to you as a public service to help leaders create better organizations for workers, consumers, and investors. Scanlon, where the best ideas come together. Our guest today is Paul Davis. Paul has served as president of the Scanlon Leadership Network for 12 years. Prior to joining the Scanlon Leadership Network, Paul was Director of Management Programs for GMI Engineering and Management Institute, more commonly known as General Motors Corporate College. Paul developed training and consulting services for the over 500 GMI sponsoring corporations. Paul Davis has a master's degree in labor and industrial relations from Michigan State University. He also interned at the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Reform. I asked Paul to share his views on leadership and to explain the 4 fundamental and time-proven Scanlon business principles that help member organizations of the Scanlon Leadership Network build effective and values-led organizations. To start the interview, I asked Paul to talk about what led him to study leadership.
Well, it's been a gradual unfolding in my life. I've been very blessed to have had the opportunity to have a number of very good leaders mentor me. And sometimes you don't realize exactly how much they meant to you until it's years later. One of my first experiences with learning what leadership is really about was the Martin Luther King Center for Social Change down in Atlanta. When Dr. King was assassinated, his widow, Coretta Scott King, set up a program for interns. A lot of them came from Michigan State University, where they had a chance to study nonviolence and to meet some exceptional leaders. I remember one of the highlights of the program was we were allowed to have dinner with Mrs. King. And I was in her home. We were having chicken dinner. She mentioned that she'd always wanted to have carpeting. And I thought that was unusual because she was a middle-class family. She could easily afford carpeting. They had linoleum. And she said that Dr. King had never allowed her to have carpeting because he believed that for many of the people that he wanted to lead, that carpeting would be the height of luxury. And many of the people in the civil rights movement were very poor. He wanted to lead those people, so he asked Mrs. King to keep the linoleum and to not have carpeting in their home. And she honored that even after, his passing. So I think that's an example of a kind of leadership that we call servant leadership. I also had an experience that happened a few years ago where I was an Eagle Scout and spent a lot of time in Scouts. I was going to a dance in our hometown, and right as the people went on break, a man collapsed in front of us. We all were waiting for a doctor to start working on him, and no doctor was there. So another person and myself, we started doing CPR. We were able to save him. His wife invited us to a dinner in our honor for having saved her husband, and we were served by his beautiful daughters, and it was a very emotional experience. And he thanked us for having done that. After that experience, I thought I was so scared when it happened. I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I just kind of went into a mode that I had been taught 20-something years before by this Boy Scout leader. And I realized that great leaders teach their followers to be able to succeed many times years after you've had the benefit of having that leader work with you. And I decided that I was going to spend a lot more time in Scouts after that and try to help bring other young men along and to teach them some of those skills. So those were sort of two experiences that I had that meant a lot to me and helped me see a form of leadership that was more than just about meetings and power and things like that, but really helping to develop the follower.
And so in your role as president of the Scanlon Leadership Network, you're in charge of working with a nonprofit organization, working with a group of businesses that model that form of leadership in their companies.
True.
Okay.
We were founded by Herman Miller, the office furniture company, and Donnelly. They make most of the mirrors that are used in cars. If you have a mirror that says objects appear closer than what they really are, that's probably Donnelly. They're now part of a Canadian company called Magna, so it's Magna Donnelly. Both those organizations were blessed with exceptional leaders early on. John Donnelly was studying for the Catholic priesthood, and then his father was sick, and he came and began running the family business. But he had a concept of leadership that was much more than most people. He had studied a lot of Catholic theologians and brought that with him. The Herman Miller Company was founded by a man named Max Dupree. Max was also a very religious man, a spiritual man. He eventually went on to become president of the Gideons. His view of leadership was much different than a typical company. In fact, on the walls of their building, they say a company is rightly judged by its products and services, but it must also face scrutiny to its humanity. That's DJ.
DJ?
DJ Dupree. DJ was the founder. He had two sons that were authors, and Hugh Dupree wrote a book called Business as Unusual, which is about Scanlon leadership and also design. Max is probably, the younger son is more well known. Max is in the Business Hall of Fame and wrote two books that have been widely read. His first book, Leadership is an Art, Inc. magazine said if you only had, I think, 8 books to start a business, that should be one of them. So both were very good writers and wrote a lot about this topic.
Briefly, would you talk about Joe Scanlon and his connection to the Scanlon plan in leadership?
Okay, Joe was a poor Irish kid who was a prize fighter. He weighed 110 pounds, so he must have fought lightweight or whatever that is. He fought at Madison Square Gardens. He was pretty good at it. He could win $1,000 a night, they said, during the Depression by fighting. He was also trained as a cost accountant, and the story goes that he would come into work after one of his fights, and he would be black and blue, and his boss said to him, "You can't be an accountant and look like that. You're going to have to make a choice." And he decided to keep the fighting, so he went into the steel mills where he could look black and blue and still fight. He must have been, I never met him, but he must have been the kind of person that a lot of different kinds of people liked, because I've met folks who did know him, and they're from all sorts of different kinds of professions, and they all said that he was a humanist. He just had a deep-seated belief in people. He ended up becoming head of the collective bargaining unit in the company he was working for, The company had just barely survived the Depression. The workers wanted more money. Joe knew that the company didn't have any more money to give. He understood the accounting. And so he went to the Steelworkers International and he said, what'll I do? I'm between a rock and a hard spot. The people want more money. The company doesn't have any more money. And the Steelworkers advised him to go back and see if he could figure out a way to make the company stronger. And so the very first Scanlon plan was nothing more than sitting down, labor and management together and cooperating to try to make work better. And at the time, it was an extremely radical idea. This was happening in the 30s and 40s. The common philosophy going then was that labor are the hands, and they do what the head, which is management, tells them to do, and that's the best way to organize work. Joe knew better than that. The average workers had all sorts of ideas how to improve the company. They just never were listened to. So his labor management team did very well. Other steel companies heard about his work. He was invited to become the acting director of the Steelworkers International. This was right as World War II was beginning, and so Joe found that there was a lot of interest in labor management cooperation for the war effort, and that's really where it got started. And he spent the war years trying to help the war effort by creating labor peace, so that they could do the production they needed to do.
So the genesis of the Scanlon plans, which is maybe the most important quality of it, is worker and management cooperation to improve performance.
Exactly.
Started during World War II. Then Joe also started to teach at MIT, right?
Yeah. After the war, labor wasn't interested in cooperating anymore. Management wasn't interested in cooperating. They were really butting heads. A lot of our labor practices are based on, who's the strongest, and not on cooperation. And
Paul, why, when they were cooperating and things were going better, why the sudden change to go back to the traditional way of not cooperating? What happened?
I think cooperating's hard, and sometimes it's easier to just exercise the power that you have
and say I'm right and you're wrong.
Correct.
Yeah.
There's actually a book that was written, I don't know the author, but it's something like When the Wolf Finally Came, which is all about the tensions in the steelworkers, the leadership of the steelworkers, as to whether or not to go down the cooperation path or to go back into more traditional kind of collective bargaining, and that side won out. But Joe was lucky because his work came to the attention of Douglas McGregor. And Douglas McGregor was at MIT. And McGregor brought Joe to be a guest lecturer at MIT during a time when there were a number of leaders in the whole field of organization development were trying to discover what makes good companies good. And it was an interdisciplinary social science kind of department. So they had economists there, psychologists, Joe as a labor person, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State.
George Shultz?
George Shultz was there at the time, too. So they were doing a lot of pioneering work. That work eventually led McGregor to come up with Theory X and Theory Y, which is his views about how assumptions drive behavior.
Can you, for our listeners, in like 2 sentences, can you say what Theory X is, and in 2 sentences say what Theory Y is?
Sure. Theory X is the idea that people are lazy, slothful, don't want to come to work, and you need to motivate them somehow to do their best.
Carry a big stick.
It could either be a big stick or a big carrot. Either one is the same thing. Most people think of a stick as the worst, but if you believe that you have to have a giant carrot to motivate people, it's still Theory X. They're not self-motivated.
Okay.
Theory Y, people believe that human nature, that work is as natural as play, that people have a great deal of creativity, they're willing to work, they just need an environment that will allow that to happen.
You are listening to the Scanlon Leadership Interview Series. I'm Ron Duffy, and we are talking with Paul Davis, president of the Scanlon Leadership Network, discussing the art and practice of leadership using the Scanlon Business Principles. Thank you. Now I, as well as our listeners, have a handle on what Theory X and Theory Y is. Please continue where you were going with this.
Well, McGregor wrote a book eventually that was called The Human Side of Enterprise, which was about a lot of their findings. He used Joe's clients, by the way, to come up with Theory Y. He noticed that they were different kinds of organizations. The real interesting thing about this is the self-fulfilling prophecy idea, that if you believe people are slothful, lazy, you'll create an organization that's managed to deal with that. And you'll see a lot of slothful, lazy people, and you'll have all sorts of control. You have lots of layers of supervision, lots of rules, regulations to try to direct behavior. If you believe in Theory Y, you'll find that in your organization. So Scanlon organizations are really built around the idea that we want to try to create Theory Y type organizations where people truly are free to be creative, to be empowered, and are self-motivated.
Okay. So where were we? You were telling me about Douglas McGregor and his Theory Y and Theory X, and he invited Joe Scanlon to teach at MIT. So that's kind of the genesis of how Scanlon plans came about?
That's true. Joe continued to evolve his ideas about how to create good workplaces. He's mostly known for a bonus plan or a gain-sharing plan. So the three big gain-sharing plans at the time were Scanlon, Rutgers, and a thing called ImproShare. At that point in the evolution of his thinking, Joe really believed that, first of all, you have to cooperate and you have to involve people. And then if you can figure out a way to tie financial performance to encouraging cooperation from the employees, and he did that through a suggestion system. He had a suggestion system that was really unusual for the time. If you submitted an idea, it couldn't be lost. It had to be tracked. That was done because some of the supervisors at the time believed that if they're supposed to be the ones that have the brains and some employee comes up with a better idea than they've got, well, we'll just lose that idea. That makes me look bad.
They're afraid for their job.
They're afraid for their job. So Joe created a system that took that away, that dynamic wouldn't happen. Employees would come up with ideas to solve problems in their immediate work area. If the idea required more money than they were authorized to spend or involved another work area, it went up until eventually the leader of the company, in a thing called a screening committee, would meet and decide, what needed to be done. And every suggestion that was rejected also went up to that screening committee, so they could see whether or not some areas the ideas were being squashed. Mm-hmm. And the bonus system was a way for the employees for a rising tide to lift all ships kind of idea, that Joe didn't believe in individual incentives. At the time he was doing his work, a common way to pay people was piecework systems. So the harder you worked, the more money you made. And those systems, he knew, created all sorts of behaviors that weren't good for the organization. Quality suffered. People would hide work that they were doing. They wouldn't work with other people. The Scanlon plan was partly a way, from a compensation point of view, was to try to get away from that. And so if they could come up with ideas that made the company stronger, then they could benefit from that.
Okay. And then Joe passed on in the 1956 or 7?
Yeah, unfortunately, Joe was a chain smoker,
mm-hmm.
and he died of emphysema.
Okay.
And he had two people that really carried on his work. One was a person by the name of Fred LeSueur, who had actually been a union president in a local that Joe was involved in. And Fred went on to put in a number of Scanlon plans really all over North America, mostly working in union companies. Another one of Joe's disciples was a professor by the name of Carl Frost. Now, Carl came out to Michigan State University and did put in a lot of Scanlon plans through Michigan State as a kind of a business extension arm of Michigan State. And it's that tradition that my association really comes out of.
So the Scanlon Leadership Network is closely associated with Carl Frost and his further improvements on the Scanlon plan started by Joe Scanlon.
Exactly. In fact, we were really his clients. His clients enjoyed coming together. And at the time, Donnelly Company was one of the very first companies to be organized completely in teams. Some of the other business people thought that was communistic. It's hard to believe now, that how radical those ideas were, but they needed a way to get together with other companies that were more progressive, and so they formed the association to be able to do that.
Paul, I think it might interest our listeners. I'm going to read this brief statement about the Scanlon Leadership Network that you are the president of, and then we're going to start talking about the principles and processes that make up a Scanlon plan or a company that follows the Scanlon plan. So here's a statement about the Scanlon Leadership Network. The Scanlon Leadership Network is a nonprofit association of organizations committed to the Scanlon Principles of identity, participation, equity, and competence. Members pioneered and are benchmark for their open book management, leadership development, employee involvement, Gainsharing, and learning systems. Members network and share best practices to make each member among the world-class leaders in their industries. Called the best-kept secret in American business and the best idea of the last 100 years by the business press, the Scanlon Leadership Network includes small businesses and multinational corporations. I think the fact that you're considered the best-kept secret in American business and the best idea in the last 100 years speaks volumes, and I would like for our listeners to know more about what's the kind of guts of a Scanlon plan. Paul, jump in, and if you want to direct this a different way, please do. But what I'm going to suggest is we start off talking about these 4 principles, and there's a process associated with the principle. You have an acronym for this. It's called EPIC Leadership. Am I right?
Correct.
As we talk about these principles, EPIC Leadership, the Scanlon Plan principles, I'd like you to weave in comments about leadership, because this is so much tied to a term you used earlier, servant leadership. So please keep those 2 things in mind.
Okay.
I'll ask you to take us through it. You use an acronym, EPIC. Start us off with one of these principles and processes.
Okay. EPIC stands for each one of the principles. E would be equity, P is participation, I is identity, and C is competency. And those were words that were developed by Dr. Frost, so they may mean different things to the listeners than what we think of them. Dr. Frost was trained as a psychologist. One of the contributions he made to Scanlon theory was that the early Scanlon plans were, as they were evolving, we were experimenting with a number of different things, but then they kind of got rigid for a while, and it was sort of one size fits all, and that didn't work. Parker Penn, for instance, had a Scanlon plan, and the early Scanlon plans had a Gainsharing formula that was based on how much labor you could take out of the product, because everybody understood how much labor they put into something. Labor really wasn't a big issue for a pen. The creation of a pen quality and a lot of other things that were much more important. So they gave up their Scanlon plan. Frost realized that every organization, every excellent organization, really has 2 kind of conflicting pulls on them. One is that you need stability, you need a safe harbor, you need something that doesn't change no matter what's happening to your company or where you are in the world or what products you make. These he called the Scanlon Principles. You also need flexibility to be able to adapt to constant change, and every organization's different. So those were the processes. We spend most of our time talking about the principles. They're even in order of importance. EPIC is a way to remember it, but we really start with identity. Identity comes from Frost's training in psychology, where he was taught how to tell if somebody was insane or not. And what he would do is you would ask somebody, what day is it? And if they said, if it's a Wednesday, and they said it's Tuesday, you know that something's wrong, that person is not in touch with reality. So when he began working in companies, he would ask questions, and he would say, well, what's the most important thing you should be working on? And the employee would say, I don't know. I think it's this, but I'm not sure. Or, who's your main customer? Well, I don't know. I just make a widget, and I don't know even where it goes. Are you making or losing money? I don't know. They don't share the financials with me. He realized that a lot of organizations were practicing a kind of a form of organizational insanity because people were just not in touch with the reality of business. The identity principle is the most important principle to Dr. Frost and to Scanlon practitioners, and it really means in a nutshell that people are given the information that they need. The process for identity, by the way, is education. They're educated to the reality of their company. So we spend a lot of time doing group meetings where they're taught who their customer is, who their competitor is, whether they're doing well or not doing well. We were some of the very first companies to practice what now is called open book management. A gentleman by the name of Jack Stack has written about it in a book called The Great Game of Business. He told us that if he had known that the Scanlon folks existed, he never would have written his book. That would have been a big mistake.
give us like 3 or 4 more sentences about open book management as we talk about the identity principle.
Okay. Every company has an accounting system or books. I mean, that's how we measure, that's how we keep score in business. The accounting system allows an organization to know whether they're making or losing money, and it's a control function so that you know whether or not you're spending money in the right way. Unfortunately, that whole system tends to be secretive, exactly. And so how do you play the game if you can't keep score? That's Jack's point.
How can you play the game well if you don't have all the information about the game?
Right. You can't really be expected to improve an organization if you don't know the critical few things you need to know in order to be able to do that business.
So open book management means the much more widely sharing of financial information to all employees in the company?
Right.
Does it go beyond financial information? Does it go wide information about how you do your job? Help me with this.
It starts with financial, but it goes way beyond that. In most of our companies, employees the strategic plans are shared with employees, so they know where we headed. For identity, too, we also look at your history as part of your identity. Most Scanlon plans will have as part of the identity section of the plan where they came from. Max Dupree said that the future is turned on the lathe of the past. So what is your past? A lot of times there are a few key people that make a company great, and so they're honored in that section. We know that all we have is the present in order to be able to improve a company. So we don't want to dwell on the past. Joe said that most people face the past and back into the future. We want people to know the past, but to be focused on the present, what they can do today, and understanding where their company's headed. We just tend to believe that the more information that's shared, the better.
Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize some things I gleaned from your materials that you provided me. The identity principle, which is associated with a process, and it's a process of education. Some key information of the identity principle based on 3 assumptions. Change is a universal given and is our only hope. 2, a person's performance/behavior are a consequence of how they have been treated. And 3, every person and organization is in the process of becoming better or worse. Practices related to the identity principle that we've been discussing: wide sharing of information, accessible leadership, open forums, visits to customers, visits to suppliers, and discussions with investors. You want to comment on any of those?
Well, I think there's a good story from Herman Miller that sort of illustrates the kind of leadership you have to have in order to be able to practice identity. And the story is an employee came into Max Dupree's office. He's the CEO of this big company, and he's demanding to know why they've spent so much money on these ponds that are outside the factory, and they're beautiful ponds. He's mad because he thinks some of his bonus checks are being wasted. Now, you could throw him out of your office, or you can use that as a teachable moment to educate somebody as to the reality of business. So Max took the time and he explained to him, did he realize that their insurance rates were lower by having the water there for fire protection? And did he realize that they needed to have the ponds because of the zoning and the need to have a drainage around the plant that was required for that? And that they were beautified because they wanted a nice place for the employees to have picnics and things like that. Now this employee knows more about the company and how business is run, and he's educated, and he can become more of a business partner. But a lot of employees don't know how to approach a leader and say that nicely. So it's, "You SOB, why are you wasting my bonus money on this thing?" And you have to be pretty thick-skinned to be a leader and practice this principle. You have to find the moment that you can educate, and you have to be willing to sometimes, sort of step out of your comfort zone a little bit. You might be attacked to do it.
We did briefly discuss that there might be legitimate fears of sharing information, and how do you overcome that?
A lot of private companies especially are afraid that if they share financial information, it will be used against them in some way. We found that most employees are very sensitive to the fact that the information shouldn't be shared with competitors and things like that. Sometimes they've even insisted that if a sheet of paper is handed out, that those papers get returned because they don't want to accidentally lose some confidential information in the parking lot or something like that. Most public companies already have to share a great deal of financial information. So with them, it's just an issue of making sure it's translated in a way that the employees can understand it. In our experience, the fear it's just not justified. The benefits are much greater.
That was maybe the point I was going to emphasize too. When the discovery the Scanlon plan has made is that doing wide sharing of information and bringing your employees, giving them all the information they might need to understand the business, understand the customer, understand suppliers, understand their job, will greatly pay off in the bottom line versus this kind of traditional secretive approach where you only get to know what you need to know. You are listening to the Scanlon Leadership Interview Series. I'm Ron Duffy, and we are talking with Paul Davis, president of the Scanlon Leadership Network, discussing the art and practice of leadership using the Scanlon Business Principles. Paul, in part one of this interview, we began discussing the 4 principles and processes associated with the Scanlon plan. The first one we talked about was called the identity principle. And to summarize for our listeners, the identity principle is educating your employees, the wide sharing of information so that they have the knowledge to do their jobs better. And it pays off in productivity in the company. Is that a fair summary?
That's a very fair summary.
And now we're going to ask you to talk with us about the second principle. The 4 principles are identity, participation, equity, and competence. So now let's talk about the second principle, participation, and the process associated with it that's called responsibility. Would you take it from there?
Okay. This is probably one of the biggest contributions that Scanlon made. It's just the idea that employees should be able to influence decisions in their areas of competency. So it's a meritocracy. We don't allow anybody to just make decisions. And
help me understand, what does meritocracy mean?
It just means the more competent you are, the more you should be able to influence decisions in that area. Now, we assume the person that's closest to the work, the person that works that machine day after day, is the most competent. That's the assumption we start with. To give you an example, we have a company that's an ESOP, and they are a printer.
ESOP means employee
stock ownership plan. It's owned by the employees, and they were trying to decide whether to buy a new press. And one of the employees said, well, because we're an ESOP, can I be part of that decision? Now, he didn't work on the press. He didn't finance the press. He had really nothing to do with the press. He worked in a completely different area of this company. And so our definition of participation, are you competent to influence? Do you really want to be influencing a decision where you don't really know anything about it? Because that's going to affect your job and your investment in an employee stock ownership plan. And so when you put it that way, no, maybe I really don't want to be able to make that decision. We don't believe in everybody being involved in everything. Most businesses can't run that way. But we definitely believe that most companies err on the other side. They just don't include the people that are going to be affected by the decision. So it's not unusual in a Scanlon company if you're going to add a new piece of equipment that the operators may even go to Germany and be there as you're deciding which piece of equipment to purchase. It's not unusual for the employees to be asked for their opinions on wide ranges of decisions. And because competency is our last principle, we're always trying to increase the competency so that employees can influence more decisions. But very few companies are a democracy. You can't stop and vote on everything. And we recognize that many times the leader has to make a decision. And so we say they influence decisions. And the best Scanlon leaders are greatly influenced by their people.
I'm going to read something about the participation principle from your literature that you give out at the Scanlon Leadership Network. Participation is defined as the opportunity which only management can give, and the responsibility which only employees can accept to influence decisions in their areas of competence. Practices associated with this participation principle are employee involvement, participative management, teams, flat organizations, and suggestion systems. What I got out of what you're saying, Paul, is the traditional model of business and management, maybe is this Taylorism, where we got managers and we got workers, and you said earlier, the head is different from the body, and the managers are the head and the workers are the body. We're going to tell you what to do and you go do it. There's lots of inefficiencies in that, And where this participation means if you have knowledge of something, if you're intimately involved with a piece of business, whether or not you're in management, we want you to be part of the decision-making process. And if you are a smart manager, you're going to recognize that, and that your job as a manager is to really allow the expertise of your people to help make good decisions and to not be afraid of that. I think there's still fear in the business sector by managers that if I let my people in on the decisions and they really come up with good input, they're going to think I'm not doing my job.
Right.
Can you respond to that?
A lot of managers are going to think that I'm paid to make the decisions, and so if they're helping, then I'm not doing my job. Or they may fear that the decision will be a worse decision. But there's some great research from Daniel Dennison, University of Michigan, on just participation, just that part of a culture. If you involve people in decision making rather than telling them what to do, you have about a 3 times greater return on investment than a traditionally managed company. Now, most companies would go through great lengths to try to increase the return on investment by just a tiny amount. If you can do that, you get a 3 times greater return simply by changing the way you manage. You need to change the way you manage. And we know that many times 2 heads are better than 1. So the quality of decision making goes up when you involve people, and the acceptance of the decision goes up when you involve people.
Are managers afraid of this because they think they'll lose their jobs?
I think so. And if you look at flatter organizations, the kind of organizations that are being built today, it's a lot of middle managers that are being flattened. So the top is still there and the bottom's still there. It's the middle that's disappearing. But I would say to any manager that's out there that might be worried about their job is that if you can learn to participate, you'll be so much more effective. There will be work for you and there'll be places for you. Those kind of managers are in demand.
Managers who have the ability to be facilitators, to involve people in healthy and respectful ways, and to guide people who probably have good ideas, but maybe they don't express it the most clearly or so on. That kind of leadership/management is very much needed, correct?
Correct. And I think partly what we're getting into is the difference between what's a manager and what's a leader. And Dr. Frost had I think a very good quote that I'd like to read about that difference. He says, "There is no unique opportunity in management, only the daily need to watch and help make things run. There is no critical responsibility in this leaderless management, only the requirement to make it to tomorrow. Management is all about coping with common opportunities and reoccurring responsibilities. Leadership is about realizing the unique chance to change and accepting the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to lead people to something different." We're really much more about leadership than about management.
Just for fun, I was looking at some quotes in your material, and this one, I think it's right on to this topic, and it made me chuckle. If you have any comment, please add it. And I'm not even sure I'm going to say one of the words right, but here's the quote. This is from Max Dupree, who was one of the owners of Herman Miller Furniture Making Company.
Correct.
This is a quote from Max Dupree. "Managers who have no beliefs but only understand methodology and quantification are modern-day eunuchs."
I don't think you could say it any clearer.
Any more you want to say about this transition, the important transition from managing to leading?
Yeah, leading is really all about change. And if you think about the world we live in, it's constant change. We have day and night. That means that if you're a business that gives you an opportunity, you can either curse the darkness or you can build light bulbs. The seasons are all about change, and so you can help people by building clothes so that they can cope with the different weather. So we live in a world that's constantly changing, and the organizations that succeed the best are ones that recognize that. And leaders help people change. They help them see the opportunities that change brings and move them to the future. And if you're going to do that, I don't think there's any better way to do it that I've seen. It's simpler than the 4 Scanlon Principles to help individuals and organizations change.
I pulled out a quote from Karl Frost, who's one of the founding philosophers of the Scanlon Plan and the Scanlon Leadership Network, correct?
Correct.
To me, I'm going to read this quote, and to me what he's talking about is the difference between a manager and what a true leader is. See if it makes sense to you. This is the quote from Karl Frost. Many organizations are being well managed by the accepted fiscal criteria in the short term, but they are not being led by long-term criteria which genuinely act to the advantage of the consumer, public, capital investors, or the total organization of employees. We can manage, it's common, let's manage for the short term, profit's the only bottom line in the next quarter, and sometimes when you manage that way, you're really harming your company because you're harming your company's ability to compete in the long term, and a leader recognizes that.
I think so. And I think this has been going on forever, Ron. Confucius said, the proper man understands equity, the small man profits. Profits are important for a business. They're a measure of success of a business, and no business can exist without profits. Profits aren't evil, but there's much more to a business than simply profits, and especially if you focus only on short-term profits, you can actually be harming the organization to generate short-term profits. You can be destroying your people. You can be running your equipment into the ground, and so there has to be kind of a longer-term view if you want to be successful in our mind. And we're very blessed. We have a number of companies that are over 100 years old. The average company today lasts less than, I think, 7 years. We must be doing something right.
So would it be fair to say the Scanlon plan and the principles involved do encompass learning about leading for the long term as well as managing your business so it's making a profit?
Yes.
I'm going to keep us moving on the principles. So now we're going to talk about the third principle. We've talked about the identity principle, the participation principle, and now the third one we'll talk about is the equity principle. I'll read a little information I have, and then I'll ask you to say more about it for us. Equity is defined as a genuine commitment to account for the needs of all constituents, including customers, investors, and employees. The process of equity is accountability. Scanlon plan leaders regularly report the organization's performance relative to customers, investors, and employees' needs. Now, processes that are associated with implementing this equity principle that you talk about in the Scanlon Leadership Network are things like gain sharing, goal sharing, profit sharing, balanced scorecards, tracking and reporting of performance results. Now that we have that basis of information out there, would you expand on the equity principle for us about what you think is important? If there's a story that comes to mind, please share that.
Okay, equity is about fairness, and every business person knows that if you don't measure something, it's hard to manage it. If you really say you believe in the importance of your customer and their satisfaction, how do you know? We have systems that have been developed to help us know if the customer is happy. The same thing with the investors and the same thing with the employees. Some of our companies also would expand the definition of equity to include community and suppliers as part of their view of the key stakeholders. But this is a very, very powerful concept, and I've run into business writers who still insist that the duty of a company is only to the stockholder. Legally, if you're a for-profit company, you are supposed to be managing the company to benefit the stockholders. But the research is very clear that if you really want to give your stockholders the best return, you have to do that by having motivated employees satisfying customers. That's what creates the wealth for the stockholder. And there was some research that was done by Cotter. The difference is amazing between just that difference in terms of cultures. Cultures where they believe that you only have one stockholder that you have to satisfy, and cultures that believe you have multiple stakeholders. In an 11-year period, he found that the returns for companies that had the equity principle, basically, the revenues grew 682%. In ones where they just viewed the stockholder as the key, it only grew 166%. The workforces of the ones with the equity principle grew 282%, and only 36% if they just believed in the stockholder. The stock prices rose 901% if they believed in equity, and only 74% if they didn't. And this is the most amazing statistic to me. Their net incomes rose 756% if they believed in multiple stakeholders, and only 1% if they believe in stockholders. So I think the financial community, the investor community, really needs to be aware of this research and needs to be putting legitimate pressure on the leadership of corporations to truly manage the company to produce the greatest return, and that's by looking at it in a balanced way.
Paul, what is your research source there?
That's a guy named Cotter, and he wrote a book on corporate culture. We've seen this, too, in our own association, that when you look at it in a balanced way, Sears did. Sears was a member for a number of years, and now, of course, they're off with Kmart. But there's a Harvard Business Review article where they actually studied how wealth was created at Sears. I don't have the date, but they actually found that that they could measure the employee satisfaction, and it had to do with did they understand where Sears was going? Did they agree with the goals? Did they like their supervisor? And they measured all that, and they could take it down to an improvement in that measure would indicate they measured customer satisfaction, and they knew that so much improvement in the employee generated so much improvement with the customer, which generated so much more improvement on the bottom line. Mm-hmm. I mean, it could get that scientific.
You are listening to the Scanlon Leadership Interview Series. I'm Ron Duffy, and we are talking with Paul Davis, president of the Scanlon Leadership Network, discussing the art and practice of leadership using the Scanlon Business Principles. This is a reaction of mine to what you're saying. I'm not sure how relevant it is, but I'll take a risk here. The statement that comes from modern physics today, everything is connected. That's one of the findings of modern physics, this looking at things in the traditional scientific method of let's break it down to its component parts and study each one and almost forget that there's relationships between these things. More and more people are understanding that breaking things down in component parts is valuable and got many technological improvements, but the other side has to come into the equation. And I'm hearing you say that looking at your business, realizing you have to satisfy multiple stakeholders. It isn't just the shareholder as one stakeholder. Stakeholder meaning somebody who has an investment in this business. But the customers, the suppliers, the community, who's watching out for the community and the global, our environment? If we so pollute our environment, there's nobody to sell to. Right. We're all dead. I'm hoping more and more business people understand that has to have equal importance.
Well, there was just a study done by a professor in Oregon on sustainability, and he found us because as he was investigating some of the companies that do the best job in sustainability, Scanlon kept coming up. And again, if people understand the reality of their business, and if they're committed, if their assumptions about human nature are, people are basically good, I think you get a different kind of company than you do if you don't have those assumptions, and also the practices that we have. So many of the Scanlon companies are also very good at sustainability, and it turns out, if you can not put waste into landfills, if you can be more efficient in the use of energy and things like that, you're having a more profitable company as well as you're helping the earth. They're not mutually exclusive.
Right, and maybe that's one of the big mind shifts that needs to occur for our time. Profitable business and sustainable, environmentally people-friendly business are not mutually exclusive ideas.
They're not.
And yet Scanlon Leadership Network really proves that with the results that your participating companies have.
True.
Let's move on to the fourth principle.
Well, for a number of years, we only had 3, and this has been evolving, and then Dr. Frost realized that it took a special kind of leader or manager to be able to work in a Scanlon environment. So we called it managerial competency for a few years, and then they realized that that's really not what they were after. What you really needed was continuous improvement, a commitment to constantly improve, and Dr. Frost views it on 3 levels: personally, professionally, and organizationally. And so the fourth principle is a little bit different than the other 3 in that the other 3 are in order of importance. You first start with identity, share the information, educate people. then you open up participation, and then you deal with accountability for your key stakeholders. Competency is kind of like a catalyst that goes through all of them. To give you an example.
Just a minute, Paul. The fourth principle is competence.
Correct.
Okay.
If we're competent, both of us, in English, so we're carrying this on in English. If I was competent in French or some other language and you were too, we could communicate that way. So it would open up additional opportunities for us. But because I'm limited in my competency, we're doing it this way. In terms of maybe I can read graphs, and if I can, you could share financial information that way to me, and I would understand. But if I'm not competent in that, I can't use a graph as a way to practice identity. I have to do something else. If you look at participation, it's the same way. Maybe I've been trained in how to do this thing called Kaizen events. That's a disciplined participation process that the Japanese invented. If I know how to do that, that's how I could participate. If I don't know how to do that, we have to involve me in some other way. So the more competent you are, the easier it is to practice any of the other three principles.
I'm going to read some information here about competence, and then if you want to add some more information. Competence is defined as the ability to respond to the constant demand for improvement and change. It requires a commitment to be in a state of becoming something that you never were before. Practices associated with the competence principle: training, development, job enlargement, and learning organizations. Any more you'd like to add about the competence principle?
Well, I think it really fits your radio show on what you're trying to do in helping people to become what they've never were before. We've been doing that for a long, long time, and we believe in it. That's why it's a commitment principle. You can, unless you're committed to change yourself personally, or your organization's committed to change organizationally, it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. It takes a conscious decision that that's what you want to do, and then you have to find the resources, to make it happen.
Paul, we're close to the end of our time here. I'd like to just share kind of a feeling I've got about the Scanlon Plan Network, or what I'm learning, and then respond to that if you wish, and if you have any final thoughts you'd like to share. The Scanlon Plan is a series of principles, a series of ideas that companies can implement, and if they do it properly and thoughtfully with the right heart and attitude, it can have tremendous improvement in a company's bottom line. They become more profitable. It can have tremendous improvement in terms of how people feel about where they work and liking it. Maybe those are the two biggest things that are coming to me. But it's not a formula. It's not the same for every organization. There are principles that you study and learn, and then you find a way to implement that are tailored to each organization. You have many, many decades of years of experience with successful companies in this process. I think we talked about earlier that very famous business publications call the Scanlon Leadership Network and the Scanlon Plan one of the best kept secrets in American business. So there's lots of good things happening here, but it's not a quick fix. It's not like a program of the day and, a manager says, here, go do this and leave me alone and come back with results. The manager has to change too, as well as the employee. It involves cooperation instead of, what word would I want to describe between traditional management and union or employee? Adversarial, yeah, antagonistic, adversarial, changing that to cooperation. Well, that's kind of the feeling I've got out of this. I guess I'd turn it over to you now.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you for the opportunity. And even though it's a challenge to do this, we know it works. And we've got a lot of help that we can support people that are interested in learning more. And there's actually a methodology that we use to install a Scanlon Plan called the roadmap process that we didn't get a chance to talk about today, but that can lead a company down the path. But you're right. Everyone's different. And I think that's the beauty of it. It's not one size fits all. And it honors what your company's already doing that's positive. So I just wanted to end with a quote from John Donnelly. John was at the Donnelly Corporation, trained in the ministry, and went again to help his father. And this is what he said to his board. He says, "Does all this sound too good to be true? Does it presume that mankind is really better than it really is? Does it demand a change of heart by many people? Are we being presumptuous?" He said yes to all four of these questions.
You've been listening to one of the Scanlon Leadership Network interview series. I'd like to thank our guest, Paul Davis, for being with us. This interview series about leadership and Scanlon business principles is brought to you by the Scanlon Leadership Network and Foundation, a nonprofit association of high-performance, values-led organizations. Scanlon, where the best ideas come together. For information on the services offered by the Scanlon Leadership Network, visit their website at www.scanlonleader.org. That's on the web at scanlonleader.org. Scanlon is spelled S-C-A-N-L-O-N. Or call 517-332-8927. That's 517-332-8927. That's our interview for today. The great Scanlon leader, D.J. Dupree, taught us that every meeting with another human being should be what he called a fortuitous encounter. We are all children of God. We all have competencies and talents. The fact that we came together should make a difference. Here's wishing that all your encounters are indeed fortuitous. I'm Ron Duffy, and on behalf of the Scanlon Leadership Network, thanks for listening.